And now on Book TV, we want to introduce you to University of Wisconsin professor Jordan Ellenberg. Professor Ellenberg, what do you do here?
I'm a professor of mathematics. I teach math, big kids, little kids, all kinds of people.
You also write books. How Not to Be Wrong is the name of it. The Power of Mathematical Thinking. In this book, you write that mathematics is not settled.
Yeah, that's very true.
What do you mean?
Well, if it were settled, there wouldn't still be mathematicians, would there? I mean, you know, math.
I thought math was certainty. Math was formulaic. Math said this 1 + 1 = 2 at all times.
Well, that part is settled. 1 + 1 = 2. We can agree on that. But there's much more that's not settled. You know, math is a process, you know, it's many thousands of years old. I mean, there's never been a culture or a civilization without math any more than there's been one without music or without drawing, right? It's one of the basic things that we do. But, you know, in many ways, we are still wrestling with the questions that were confusing to the ancient Greeks and the Sumerians and the Egyptians. Like I mean, we've expanded our circle of knowledge to a large extent, but there's much more we don't know than that we know.
What's an example of that? What don't we know yet?
Well, just to give an example that's been in the news lately, we have known for thousands of years that there are infinitely many prime numbers, you know, numbers like 2 and 5 and 7 and 13 that can't be factored. Basically the atoms, if you like, of numbers. But here's a crazy thing we don't know. We actually don't know. Remember I mentioned 5 and 7? They're only 2 apart. They're almost right next to each other. We don't know whether there are infinitely many pairs of primes that are 2 apart. We don't know whether these little twin primes, as they're called, whether they just go on and on forever or whether they eventually stop. People have wondered for hundreds of years, and we steadily get closer and closer. There was a big advance in this area a couple of years ago, but we still don't know. We might find out tomorrow. We might not find out for another 50 years. We might never find out.
So what? What does it matter if we know what prime numbers are not?
Well,
what purpose do they? Do they serve a purpose?
Well, that's a great question. Here's what we know about math. It seems to describe the basic structure of the way things are, the universe and just reality. Now, any individual mathematical fact, do I know why we need to know that? Is that going to cure cancer tomorrow? Is that going to build a better missile? Probably not. And I wouldn't actually be allowed to tell you if it were with a missile. But history has shown us that somehow advances in math always bring with them massive advances in knowledge of all kinds of things. We are constantly using things that were developed by mathematicians purely for the sake of understanding, right? Purely because there was a puzzle just about the way things are. Not with any idea of practical application. And yet the practical applications do tend to come.
In your book, first of all, where did you come up with the title, How Not to Be Wrong?
Oh, I had that title for a long time before I even knew what the book was going to be about, actually. It's probably, to some extent, a reference. I don't know if you ever saw this. There was an old Monty Python sketch called How Not to Be Seen. And it was about how to hide. And if you didn't hide, they kept on sort of tricking people into standing up, and then they would explode them with a bomb. Very typical kind of 60s British humor. So I think it's, in some sense, comes from that. But I mean, the real reason for that title is because I want people to think about mathematics not as this kind of sterile series of exercises, which, to be quite honest, for many people, that is their interaction with math, right? That's their interaction with math in school. But it's not. I mean, every mathematical technique we have, every mathematical object, every definition, every theorem was created to solve a problem. That's its origin. Was created because people were confused about something and they wanted to be less confused. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to take these mathematical things and talk about what problems they were originally for. Like to go back in history to when did people not understand this? Why did they want to understand it? And what was it like, the process of figuring it out?
What does the Pythagorean theorem solve?
Well, the Pythagorean theorem actually was pretty practical right from the start. I mean, the Pythagorean theorem tells you if you have a right triangle, so if you have a triangle or one of the angles is a nice square angle like this, and you know how long this side is, and you know how long this side is, you want to know how long the other side is. If you are actually physically building a structure, and you know, when you build a building, like right angles are pretty useful. It's pretty cool for your buildings, like not to be slanted, but actually to stand up straight. You know, you want to brace a cross beam across the diagonal of a rectangle. You actually do need to know like how much wood you're going to need. So that one is actually, I mean, that's much less abstruse and theoretical than most of the stuff I work on in my day job.
You tell the story in your book, Professor, about Abraham Wald. Who is he? Who was he?
Yeah, this is kind of an amazing story. So Wald was a guy, and he was actually, I mean, the purest of the pure kind of mathematicians, let me tell you, but he grows up in Hungary and then was working in Austria. And then in the 30s, when the Nazis take over, he's got to leave, right? He's got, like a lot of people, he has to get out quickly. He ends up in the United States, working in an economics institute. And during World War II, he is working at this top secret math and statistics lab right near Columbia University. I actually had no idea until I was researching this that there was such a thing. It was kind of like the Manhattan Project, except it was actually in Manhattan. It was all these very famous statisticians, including Wald. And the story that I tell in the book is a group of generals come to this group, the statistical research group was called the SRG. They come to the SRG and they come to Wald and they say, well, we've noticed something funny. The planes that are coming back from flying missions over Germany, there's more bullet holes in some parts of them than others. They're getting hit more in the fuselage and they're getting hit less in the engines. And they said, we want to know how much more armor should we be putting on the places where the planes are getting hit more? Like, how much more heavily should we be armoring the fuselage? I mean, this is a real question, right? Because you don't want to put too much armor on or the plane won't fly, right? You don't want to put too little on or the plane's not safe. So they said, Abraham Wald, maybe is there some kind of mathematical formula you can give us, right? For like how many times more armor we should be putting on the parts of the plane that are getting hit more. And Wald says, you guys have it completely wrong. You have to put the armor where there are no bullet holes. Okay, this is like kind of weird, right? You put yourself in the position of the general. Like, why are you telling me to do the exact opposite of what makes sense? What Wald points out to them is that it's not that the Germans can't hit their planes on the engines. It's that the planes that get hit on the engines are the ones that are not coming back from Germany. So their sample, the planes that they're seeing, that's not like a random sample from all the planes, right? They are seeing the ones that didn't get shot in the engines and so didn't get shot down. So what's interesting about this is that he didn't actually give them the kind of answer they were expecting, right? He didn't give them a formula. He didn't give them a spreadsheet. He didn't give them a number. Nonetheless, what he did was deeply mathematical. Mathematics is not just about numbers, right? I mean, mathematics is about understanding, and it's about taking a question and asking, what assumptions underlie that question? Is it correct? Is it even the right question in the first place? I mean, giving the answers to questions is like pretty easy, but asking the right question, that is profound, and that's what mathematical thinking is really about.
In your book, you also talk about the Laffer curve. Is the Laffer curve, first of all, what is it, and is it mathematically defensible?
Yes, and I defend it, actually. I mean, it's an interesting, so the story, probably not a true story, but it's too good not to tell anyway, is that it's called the Laffer curve because it was drawn on a napkin by Arthur Laffer, who is a well-known conservative economist and thinker during the Reagan administration. And what the curve is meant to depict is the following. Here's a question. How high should taxes be? What should the tax rate be? Well, there's two extremes. If your tax rate is 0, if you don't tax people at all, then the government is not going to get any tax money. That's pretty clear. What's also true, though, is let's say the tax rate was 100%. Every single penny you earn gets taken in taxes. Then nobody's going to work, right? Or if they work, they're going to sort of find ways to hide it from the government. And the government also gets no revenue. So 0% tax rate, no government revenue. 100% tax rate, no government revenue. Somewhere in between, right? It has to go up and then down. That's the mathematical fact, that a curve that is down here at the endpoints has to have a maximum somewhere in between. There's some optimal rate. What Laffer believed, now you have to imagine the virtual blackboard here, what Laffer believed is that we were over on this side of the curve where increasing taxes would actually bring government revenue down instead of up. Now, Laffer was probably wrong about that. That's what economists at the time mostly thought, and I think that's what economists in 2015 pretty universally think. So he was wrong about where we were on the Laffer curve, but he was right about the general picture, that there is some rate of taxation which is so high that increasing it further paradoxically reduces the amount of taxes that the government actually gets. So he's often, I mean, he is often kind of scoffed at, and I think to some degree unfairly.
How is it that Steven Pinker comes up in your book, How Not to Be Wrong?
Well, Pinker is a very interesting guy, right? Because he's a psychologist. I mean, he comes from the social scientists, but I think he's very mathematically inflected. And I was really struck by his most recent book, which is very quantitative in nature. And he writes about the fact that in many ways, for all the terrible things that we see in the news and in the newspaper every day, I kind of have to turn the front page over when it comes in the house to hide it from my kids because I don't want to get asked a lot of questions. For all this, he argues that the world is actually much safer and more pleasant and quieter and more peaceful now than it ever has been in human history. And one part of his argument is to say that while we have these kinds of horrible events on a global scale, things like World War II, which kills tens of millions of people, the world is also much bigger now. So that in terms of the percentage of the world's people who are killed or otherwise injured by some calamity, there were things that happened a long time ago that were, proportionally speaking, quite a bit worse. So I think this raises a very interesting question, which is, do you think that a calamity that kills 10,000 people in a world with population, let's say 100 million, is the same thing as a calamity that kills, let's say, 100,000 people in a world with a population 10 times as big, a billion? It's the same percentage of the world's population, right? But is one worse or better than the other, but are they the same? This is kind of an interesting question because it mixes both math and just your general moral sentiments, right? It's not a question that you can actually answer by math alone. There's no math formula for which thing is worse than which other thing. On the other hand, you also can't answer the question without, at least in part, thinking quantitatively of what are you doing if you try to measure the scale of some kind of disaster, whether it be a natural disaster or a war.
And I think Steven Pinker appears in your chapter, How Much Is That Worth in Dead Americans?
Yes, it's sort of a cheekily titled chapter, I guess. But
what's that chapter about?
I mean, that chapter is, it refers to this very common practice when something bad happens in what to us is a foreign place. People try to convey the sense of it. They say, well, this island has a population of 20,000 and climate change threatens to displace 1,000 of them who live in the low-lying region. That's 1 out of 20 people, so they would say, oh, that's the same as if 15 million Americans were displaced. So, how much is that in dead Americans, or how much is that in displaced Americans? People always try to well, it's quite natural, right? I mean, for an American audience to take something that happened far away and be like, well, what is the equivalent thing in American terms?
10 Israelis are killed in a terrorist attack, or 10 Palestinians are killed.
Right, and you would say, oh, that's the same as 500 Americans or something like that. So what I say...
Is that fair?
So what I say in the book, I think this is a great example of you can set up the math to give you that answer. That's a perfectly good mathematical answer to a certain question. The question is that the right question? Because I think, at least to me, you get into quite morally dicey territory when you say, oh, 10 Israeli lives mean the same as 500 American lives. You can do that on your spreadsheet, but when you actually listen to the words that are coming out of your mouth, you're like, wait, is that really what I want to say? And I think that's a great example of the mathematical thinking has to go hand in hand with all the other parts of your cognition, like your moral mind, your aesthetic mind, your just general commonsensical mind.
But we use that statistic quite a bit, don't we? And I know this is not the point of your book, but how much lying is done with statistics in your view?
Oh, I think that is one of the points of my book, by the way. And actually, I think what's interesting is that when you talk about lying, you think about intentional malfeasance, right? You think about somebody who's really trying to snooker you and pull the wool over your eyes. I actually think most of the bad statistics in this world, and let me tell you, if you're at the breakfast table with me, you will hear me snort about something probably every day I read something in the paper that I just roll my eyes at. I would say most of the time, the large majority of the time, that's not somebody intentionally being honest. That's somebody who has fooled themselves. There's something that they want to say, there's something they want to believe, and they find a way to enlist some kind of numerical data to their cause. And it's not because they're intentionally trying to cheat you, it's because they're, in a sense, cheating themselves.
Professor Ellenberg, we talk today, a political issue is income inequality.
Right.
How do you look at that as a mathematician?
I think a really interesting question is even, how do you measure income inequality? Like, how do you look at two different societies and say, is this one more unequal than that one? Or how do you look at the same society in different periods of time and say, how has inequality changed? I mean, here at least to the best of my knowledge, if you compare the United States of today with the United States that I grew up in, let's say in the 1980s, I don't think there's any dispute that our society is more economically unequal now. I think basically you can choose any measure you want, and that story is pretty clear.
If somebody sits down at the blackjack table, should they play for 2 hours or 10 hours mathematically?
Boy, I have to say, I think I have been to a blackjack table once in my life. I lost $20, and I think it took me about 4 seconds. So at that rate, I don't think I have enough capital to sit for either 2 hours or 10 hours.
I'm not just asking questions. You talk about gambling in your book.
I do, and I think gambling is such a fascinating test case because, once again, people have moral feelings about it. They have mathematical feelings about it. I think everybody knows that for most people in most circumstances, gambling is not a wise investment, right? I mean, if you have money that you want to do something with, probably playing blackjack with it is not the most revenue-enhancing choice that you could make. This leads actually to what I write about in the book especially is one of the most popular kinds of gambling there is, which is playing the lottery. It's not quite as glamorous as going to Las Vegas and playing the blackjack table, but it's incredibly popular and it's distributed throughout the country. Almost everyone will tell you it's a bad bet. So why do so many people do it? So I write a lot. There's a crazy story that I write about a lottery in Massachusetts with a quirk that actually allowed several groups of people to rather reliably make quite a lot of money over many years. But that's, of course, a very unusual situation, right? Most people who play the lottery are going to lose, on average, most of the time. I think the conclusion that most people would say is that people actually enjoy playing the lottery. I mean, partly, yes, they play because they hope to win, but in some sense, I think there's an argument that you get a certain amount of money's worth of entertainment out of each ticket you buy, and that's certainly a big part of people's motivation doing it.
Is that a mathematical answer?
I think it depends who you ask. I think it's obviously very dangerous territory to talk about, can you quantify enjoyment? Can you quantify how much fun you're having and say, how many dollars is that worth? So on the one hand, you can see that that's a hard problem. On the other hand, people do trade dollars for fun all the time, right? People sort of say, I'll go to this movie. Oh, it costs $12, I don't want to go. Oh, it costs $5, I'll go. So whether or not it can be made mathematically precise, people are certainly making these kinds of judgments all the time. So I would say certainly lots of economists would say that's absolutely a mathematical question. You have different kinds of what are called utility, the utility of entertainment, the utility of happiness, the utility of safety, right? Lots of people dislike gambling because they don't like that suspenseful feeling of being unsafe or feeling like you're at risk, right? So for those people, there would be like a negative utility of playing the lottery. So I think it's quite standard in economics actually to assign numerical values to all of these things.
Professor Jordan Ellenberg, the Baltimore stockbroker. Where'd you come up with that, and who is he or she?
The Baltimore stockbroker, yeah, it's a figure of mathematical folklore, and it's kind of a con game. I'll explain how it works. So here's what happens. You get in the mail a newsletter from a stock tipper. He says, I've got a great tip for you. This particular stock is going to go up next week. Buy it now. So we know the story is at least as old as when people would get newsletters in the mail. I don't know exactly how old it is. So you read this and you assume it's a scam, but just for kicks, you look at the newspaper the next day and you see that indeed that stock did go up. You're like, oh, interesting. Well, you forget about it. But the next week, you get another newsletter in the mail. And it has another tip. It says, so-and-so stock is going to go down. If you've got it, sell it. Like, this stock is a stinker. And you read the business section the next day, and you see that just as the Baltimore stockbroker predicted, the stock has gone down. Another week goes by, you get another tip. Another week goes by, you get another tip. 10 weeks in a row, this guy correctly predicts the motion of whatever stock he's written about in his newsletter. And at that point, right, you're pretty amazed. At that point, you're ready to give this guy your life savings. This guy somehow, I don't know how he's doing it, but he knows what's going on. Okay, that's the Baltimore stockbroker. What don't you know about this story? What you don't know is that on the first day when you got that newsletter, the Baltimore stockbroker actually sent out 1,000 newsletters. 500 of them said the stock was going to go up. 500 of them said the stock was going to go down. Okay, what happens to the 500 people who got the bad tip? They never hear from the Baltimore stockbroker again. And the next week, 250 people get a tip that so-and-so stock is going to go down, the correct one. 250 people get the tip that that same stock is going to go up. So that guy is covering all his bases. Right? 10 weeks later, it's probably down to just you. You're the lucky one, or depending on how you look at it, the unlucky one, who is completely convinced. And all he needs is one, right? That's the way cons work. All you need is one sucker on the line. You don't have to have 1,000. One is enough. And so, I mean, what this sort of parable symbolizes mathematically is that you can't always make a good inference from the information that's in front of you. Sometimes you need to know, not only what you observed, but also what you didn't observe, right? You did not observe, all the chances this guy had. You're like, it's amazing. How could somebody get 10 stock tips correct in a row? Well, if you've got 1,000 chances, you can do that. A lot of crazy stuff can happen if you give yourself enough chances to get it right.
Finally, Professor, big data and mathematics.
I mean, it's the word of the day, right? The word of the year, the word of the decade. I love it. I mean, it's an amazing subject, and I would say, I think about this kind of stuff a lot in my research life. It's not so much that it's big. If I had one thing to say about it, we could do another hour. But it's not so much that it's big. If I want to add up 1 trillion numbers, mathematically, that's no more difficult or profound or interesting than adding up 2 numbers. Same operation, just on a larger scale. What's interesting is that the data that we have now, we have it from social networks, we have it from internet usage, the NSA has it from God knows where. We've got a lot of stuff. It's not just that it's big, it's that it's structured, right? It has all kinds of structures embedded in it, the structures of networks of people, geographic structures, time structures. Mathematicians are, I would go so far as to say, having to invent a new kind of statistics as we go. The old methods are just not suitable for this kind of data. They were designed for other things, like controlled trials that we did one at a time. Now we've kind of got the fire hose trained on us, and we're trying to figure out how to deal with it. So it's actually an incredibly exciting time when there's so many new problems, just trying to figure out how do you make sense of a spreadsheet that's 1 trillion by 1 trillion, right? The human brain cannot do that. That's not what it's built to do. We have to figure out how to interpret those numbers, and we don't know yet. It's not magic, right? So I think a lot of people will have an interest in making it sound like we really understand how to deal with that data, how to make good inferences from it. I don't think we do yet. I hope we will.
We've been talking here at the University of Wisconsin with mathematics professor Jordan Ellenberg. How Not to Be Wrong is the name of the book, The Power of Mathematical Thinking. This is Book TV on location in Madison on C-SPAN 2.
You know perhaps that I have the record for the longest single answer to a question on book, Brian Lamb. So you cut me off if I've become...
Okay, if I could have your attention, we'd like to get started. I'm Brian Anderson. I'm the editor of City Journal. I'd like to welcome you all today on behalf of the Manhattan Institute and the National Review Institute to what will be a fascinating morning of discussion devoted to the new edition of William F. Buckley's classic book, The Unmaking of a Mayor, which has just been released in a 50th anniversary commemorative edition by Encounter Books. Now, in 1965, New York City was entering a long crisis that would get worse and worse for the next 3 decades. Crime and drug abuse were rising alarmingly. Murder was up more than 30% since the beginning of that decade. And by some estimates, as many as 80,000 addicts were living in the city. More than 500,000 people were on welfare. The streets were a massive traffic jam. Businesses and residents were running for the city exits, seeking cheaper and safer locations in the suburbs. The two leading candidates for mayor that year, Brooklyn Democrat Abraham Beame and Republican Representative John Lindsay, the eventual winner, proposed nearly identical solutions to this crisis: higher taxes, ramped up social spending, and more federal aid, tin cup urbanism as it came to be called. To William F. Buckley, the then 39-year-old editor of the dynamic conservative magazine National Review, which he had launched a decade earlier, this approach was doomed to fail. Indeed, it would only worsen the crisis, he believed, since misguided liberal policies were largely to blame for New York's plight. He decided to run for mayor on the ticket of the then new Conservative Party. His book recounts that remarkable experience. It remains strikingly relevant, the book, for its insights into urban politics and what kind of policies help cities flourish, some of which New York would adopt beginning in the mid-90s, turning the city around dramatically, but which may be under threat again today. So thanks for coming again, and let me turn the mic over to my friend Jack Fowler, National Review's tireless publisher.
Thank you, Brian. I just may be the tired publisher. I don't know about tireless. Good morning. A few brief remarks. We all have our fears. My big one is this, that a major anniversary will have passed without it getting due attention. And to my relief, more than in the nick of time, a couple of years back, I realized that 2015 would mark the 50th anniversary of Bill Buckley's historic mayoral run. Mike Long, chairman of the New York State Conservative Party, is here, so I will be in trouble if I did not note that Bill Buckley was the Conservative Party candidate. I want to check that box, Mike. I'm happy to be in the company of so many people who believe Bill's political foray proved to be something of real, lasting importance, of major consequence. And here we are today to mark that, to note that, to celebrate that. Before we do, a few thanks to Roger Kimball and the good people at Encounter Books, who were quick to say yes to the idea of republishing Bill's classic memoir, The Unmaking of a Mayor, which many believe to be one of America's premier political works. We thank Neil Freeman for his foreword and Joe Scarborough for his afterword of the new edition. To my friend Lindsay Craig, who is the dynamic president of the National Review Institute, founded by Bill Buckley in 1992, and which holds in its mission the portfolio to protect and enhance the Buckley legacy. NRI co-sponsors this event. To the other co-sponsor, the Manhattan Institute, it is a great institutional friend of National Review and a great friend of all who want to see our cities thrive. I'd like to offer special congratulations to Brian Anderson and his team for NRI's premier publication, City Journal, which just celebrated its 25th anniversary. It is a tremendous, tremendous issue. So is the 60th anniversary issue of National Review. So is every issue of National Review. Edited by my friend and colleague, Rich Lowry. Tomorrow is National Review's 60th anniversary. Hooray! 60 years young, our wannabe mayor would have been proud. Thank you to C-SPAN for being here and sharing today's reflections on candidate Buckley with its wonderful audience. Before I close, in this audience before me, there are two people I'd like to recognize. One is Ed Capano, my predecessor as publisher, who toiled at NR for some 26 years and who was there way back in 1965, smack dab in the middle of all the Buckley for Mayor hoopla and madness. We celebrate our 60th anniversary at National Review in no small part because of Ed's many years of leadership. And then there is a man who has too many titles: judge, ambassador, senator, sometimes that is qualified as the sainted junior senator, author. He is one of the great public servants of our lifetime, and the man who, as campaign manager of Buckley for Mayor, led the intrepid editor politician to a third-place finish. But the most important third-place finish ever. I'm thrilled that he is with us today, the Honorable James Buckley. And now, my good friend, who will moderate and introduce the first panel, the senior editor of National Review and the author of the acclaimed new work, Children of Monsters, Jay Nordlinger.
Thank you, Jack. Well, we have before us a splendid couple. I was at a dinner not long ago, about 20 people, and we were to introduce ourselves, and Norman said a couple of words about himself, and then Midge jabbed a thumb at Norman and said, "I belong to him." Well, he belongs to her too. Midge Decter is a famous writer and editor, the author of several books and hundreds or thousands of articles. One of the many things I like about Midge is that she was, as you may remember, the executive director of the Committee for the Free World in the last stage of the Cold War. When that war was won, she dissolved the organization, which never happens because they go on and on with other excuses. She said, "We won," and stopped. But of course, there's always a need for a Committee for the Free World. Midge's memoir is an old wife's tale. Norman Podhoretz is Norman Podhoretz. He was editor of Commentary for 30 years.
35.
Beg your pardon.
35.
1960 to 1995. Got it. I'm working on my math. Speaking of math, he has written a great many books, including 3 or 4 memoirs, all of them masterly. And I'd like to mention a book that's one of his, I would say, least known or celebrated books, Why We Were in Vietnam. It's a very important book, and it answers that question. It helped me a great deal. Finally, I will say, and Norman, please shut your ears, because I always say this when I introduce Norman, the 2 people most responsible for my political formation are Bill Buckley and Norman Podhoretz. But as authors say in the acknowledgement sections of their books, they're not to be held responsible for my errors. So, Midge, we're back in 1965. You're just a slip of a girl from Minnesota. And I want to know, where were you politically? Or as we said in the 70s, where was your head at, we used to say, in 1965 politically? Were you migrating left to right or what?
Well, I was, but I didn't know that I was. I thought where I was a devotee of the labor movement because it seemed to me they were the only really reliable anti-communists in the country. And that was a leading passion, was anti-communism. And one was hard put to come by people who really felt the same passion, except on the left, actually, on the near left. So there I was. I'll let him talk about his leftism. Mine was slightly different because I came from Minnesota and we are very stupid.
You're not speaking of the election of Al Franken, I trust.
Well, happily, I was not there when that happened, but it could have happened when I was there. So where was I? I was a big liberal. I had not the faintest idea that somebody named Ronald Reagan would come along and lift my heart. Not then, not in those days, I didn't. And I had my primary loyalty was really, I think, to the labor movement, the left, the anti-communist socialist left.
Midge, the year before Goldwater had happened, he ran for president, and the right said, "In your heart, you know he's right," and the left said, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." Where did you stand on Goldwater?
I stood with the left. Mm-hmm. I could not believe in the Goldwater candidacy. I couldn't even believe in the reality of the Goldwater candidacy. Mm. That's where I was then. But there was one thing that, in the end, saved me, and that was that I knew that there was something wrong with the left. I was a member of it, but always ill at ease, and especially in '65. I mean, that's when our wonderful children, the great young, remember the young people, our wonderful young people who were rioting in their universities and everything. It was clear that was bad news. But the only way you could hang on to the left was through the labor movement, because it was anti-radical.
Midge, in 1965, did you have the sense that New York was going to pot, or would that come only later?
Oh boy. No, it didn't come later. It was already gone to pot as far as people like us were concerned. We were living on the Upper West Side, and it wasn't safe. There was crime in the streets, and if you were going to work and then you had a plan for the evening, you did not go home, because that would require a trip back to the neighborhood and then another trip down. You had to be very careful. So things are really, really bad. And from my point of view, the worst of it was, of course, we had children. And if you had children, there was the schools question. And everything you did, I mean, the two of us worked 3 jobs each in order to pay tuition for 3 children in private school, and then ultimately 4 children in private school, because you could not send your children to the public school. Not where we lived, you couldn't.
So in 1965, Bill Buckley's been editor of this magazine, National Review, for 10 years. Norman's been editor of commentary for 5. Were you working at Harper's?
Not yet.
Okay. Did you know, Bill, the firing line had not started?
No.
The firing line started the next year, I believe, 1966. You didn't know Bill yet. Did
No.
you, Norman? Had you met him?
I must have, because something very peculiar happened. When the campaign for mayor was over, he called me out of the blue, and he said something like, "I'm thinking of writing something about my Midsummer Madness," I think he called it, "and would you be interested in publishing it?" And although I was very much on the left, I have a weakness for a pretty sentence, and I admired Buckley as a writer, something people don't stress enough. So I said, sure, by all means. And the article never materialized because it became the book. So that was my contact with him. In later years, when I got to know him well, and I confessed rather sheepishly that an article in Commentary, incidentally, it's also Commentary's 70th anniversary.
Yes.
That's another one. When I was a junior editor at Commentary in the late 50s, we ran an article which I had actually commissioned from Dwight MacDonald about the first, whatever it was, issues of National Review. And it was very severe. And I confessed to Bill that I was the author of the title of that piece, which was Scrambled Eggheads on the Right. And I don't think he ever quite forgave me for that. The other thing he never quite forgave me for was something I did to the sainted junior senator when Pat Moynihan, who was in those years a very close friend of mine, ran for senator for the U.S. Senate in New York in
76.
76, yeah. And I was what somebody once called the éminence juif of that campaign. I'm not going to translate that. If you don't get it, that's just too bad. And we were very close personal friends, and I was helping him to the extent that I could. And he had just won the primary against the abominable Bella Abzug by a hair, by 1 point, something like that.
She wore a hat on her hair.
She always did. And here we were running against Jim Buckley. And in a speech that he gave, I don't think I wrote it, but I read it and perhaps edited it, I suggested that we say we've just beaten the radicalism of the left, and now we're up against the radicalism of the right. And I later learned that Bill Buckley, probably not the sainted Jim, because he doesn't get angry at things.
He's too pure.
He's too pure.
Yeah, I can see him grinning now.
Bill was furious at calling his brother a radical of the right.
And you were soon to be called a radical rightist yourself?
That's right. And there's some people who think that there is no position to the right of me.
Yeah.
Except they don't know my children. To our mutual surprise, in later years, I don't remember exactly when it happened, Bill and I became very close friends in the last, 20 years of his life?
Yeah, something
15? I don't know. But it was a very warm and cordial friendship.
Norman, when you became a famous writer, I think the New York Public Library came to you and said, would you participate in this series? Why don't we go back to your old neighborhood in Brooklyn where you grew up, and we'll take some photos and so on. And you said, I wouldn't go back there unless in a tank.
Right.
Now try to remember in 1965, the neighborhood you grew up in, was that neighborhood then relatively peaceable, or had it become something like a war zone?
No, the neighborhood is Brownsville in Brooklyn, and it got worse and worse and worse and worse, and I believe today it and the neighboring neighborhood, East New York, have the record in the history of the world for number of murders per population.
But when you grew up, were you carefree on the streets, or was it dangerous?
Oh no, it was dangerous, and I myself got beaten up a few times. Once very seriously by a black schoolmate. Actually, I wrote about that in a notorious essay called "My Negro Problem and Ours" that appeared in 1963. I can describe the feel of, Midge talked about the Upper West Side not being safe. Well, we had a car at one point, and there was the nearest garage was on 100th Street and Broadway, the east side of Broadway. We lived on 105th Street between Broadway and West End. So if you parked your car, as I often had to do at midnight or thereabouts, and walk from there, from 100th Street, across the street and up to 105th Street, it was like traversing a minefield. Mm-hmm. You'd say, well, is the gang hanging out over there more dangerous than the one over there? Where do I cross? Which one do I take a chance for? And it was that was about the way it felt.
Did you think about decamping to Washington or elsewhere, the way your friends the Crystals would?
Well, that happened
Or were
later.
you just bound to be in New York come hell or high water?
Well, I'm afraid that's true. I mean, but the exodus from New York to Washington, Irving Kristol and others took place later.
Okay.
And things got worse in New York.
Midge, back to 65. Were you a Lindsay man, so to speak, or a Beam man, or neither? You didn't vote for Bill, I imagine. Or did you?
No, certainly not. But if I don't remember. I didn't even vote.
Norman?
But if I had, it would have probably
Been
reluctantly been for Beam.
Yeah.
Because what could you do?
I think I probably voted for Lindsay, but I don't remember.
Who was
I
then a
never
Republican?
liked him.
Personally?
No, yeah, as a figure. I mean, there was something about him that put me off.
He
And
was
I
very
loved
aristocratic, was he not? Handsome guy?
Handsome, and the portrait of Lindsay in the book, in The Unmaking of a Mayor, is the best thing about that book, in my opinion. It's just delicious. And Bill never ran out of clever epithets and turns of phrase to describe, one abomination after another that that Lindsay committed during the campaign.
He later, in a kind of gesture, late in his life, Bill, or late in Lindsay's, I can't quite remember, but Bill invited him to cruise with him. I don't think it came off.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, his fire was mostly directed at Lindsay, not at Beam.
He wanted an intra-Republican fight, so to speak.
Well, he was trying to establish that this liberal Republican was more liberal than Republican.
Yes.
And that there was basically, as they used to say, not a dime's worth of difference between Lindsay on the Republican ticket and Beam on the Democratic ticket. And that's true. They had virtually the same platform. And Bill was partly to establish the credentials of the Conservative Party as a genuine alternative, not necessarily just in that election, but as a force in New York State, and also to dispel any confusion out there that might attend the nature of Lindsay as a political figure. And Bill was right. I mean, Lindsay became a Democrat eventually, and did very, very badly in his quest for, what did he run for, governor as a Democrat, senator or governor, I don't remember.
Yeah, he definitely turned, which was, I think, honest of him.
Yeah, oh yeah, he made an honest man of himself, right.
Midge, it's been a long while since I read Bill's books, but I think I devoured them in my 20s and 30s. And I remember thinking that I thought The Unmaking of a Mayor was the best nonfiction book. I think my favorite novel was Stained Glass, his second Blackford Oaks. But do you have a view of this? Do you remember reading The Unmaking of a Mayor?
I don't remember reading. I read it now. I don't remember reading it.
Does it still
at the
dazzle?
time.
I think I read it 25 years ago. Does it dazzle still?
Oh yes, it dazzles, but I don't find it more dazzling than than anything else written by Bill Buckley. Dazzle is the word, and
I think it's one of my, forgetting Bill's books, I think it's one of my favorite American political books. Shows that he was not just literary, he was a political animal, wasn't he? Certainly in that book and in that period.
yes, he was. In the end, in my own life, he was the kind of political animal. He was what one would consider a political animal, which is to say, he translated into thinking about things what his sensibility had known all along, if I can put it that way. But it took me a long time to get there. Really not until, certainly I was against the left, and I knew that was bad news, but was fishing around for alternatives. So there was, as I said, the labor movement. Then there was something called the Social Democrats U.S., which was a splinter off the Socialist Party. And if you were looking for something unfindable, as I was doing, you ended up with splinters of splinters until, and I have to say it was not Buckley, it was Ronald Reagan, who came along, and by then one knew that one had found one's political feet.
Well, Midge, I often quote you about something, so if I'm wrong, I have a lot of apologizing to do. But I believe when you were asked to become a trustee of the Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank in Washington, you said, there comes a time to join the side you're on. Is that true?
Yes, except if I can correct you.
Please.
You must always join the side you're on, is what I said. And by then I was certainly on that side, but that was quite late. That was 1980.
Norman, do you have a favorite Buckley book?
Yeah. Trouble is I can't remember the name of it.
I can tell you had well, maybe I can help you. I want to hear you speak about The Unmaking, but I remember you wrote a sterling defense of Bill's memoir, Overdrive,
That's
which had
the
been
one.
attacked.
That's the one.
And Bill quoted you at length, of course, in, I think, the foreword to his next edition.
Yeah, that is my favorite book because
Overdrive, yeah.
it's the most eloquent tribute to the virtue of gratitude that perhaps has ever been written. And the lack of gratitude is, I think, the besetting sin of our culture. And the reason I wrote that paean to it, and it was this very sincere paean, a lot of people said I was crazy, was that it had been attacked in the most disgustingly vulgar terms.
Yes.
Oh, this guy rides around in a big limo, and I mean, it was, it was just.
It was the limo scene that really killed people.
Well, see, but the thing is that one of the things Bill was saying all along is that every one of his blessings is something for which he was grateful, including the stretch limo.
Yeah.
And that was what was so.
You know what especially killed them? He described his indoor pool, a little lap pool,
Most
as the
beautiful this side of Pompeii.
most beautiful pool this side of Pompeii. It just killed people.
Right. But it was, that absolutely is my favorite. And I must confess, I reread Unmaking of a Mayor the last week or two, and I was disappointed in it. And I shouldn't say that on this occasion, but...
Oh, you're an honest critic, always have been.
well, it has its long nerves, and particularly in the amount of, which I didn't remember, the amount of wonkery that's in it. I mean, there's a big, long section in the middle summarizing the 12 position papers.